All right, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Adam Holdren. I'm the Director of Choice Grants with the Division of Choice for the Tennessee Department of Education. We are all here today to talk about the Non-Public Schools GEER Grant. This is the second round of funding that's becoming available. And so let's go ahead and get started and figure out what we need to do here. Someone's speaker on. Just give me some feedback. Let's see what's going on. All right, so as with everything we do for the TDOE, we are aligned with our best for all priority. We will set all of our students on a path to success. This grant is aligned with that just as much as anything else is. We want to make sure our students have the resources that they need in order to be successful and succeed. And so this funding is allowing us to get closer to that priority. The agenda for what we're going to be going over today, we're going to talk a little bit high level about the grant itself. We're going to talk about what the grant's going to look like, and then we're going to specifically go into the application process. So what is the application you will need to complete in order to claim your funds? So let's get started on the grant high level. Several of you may have in the past received EANS funding, EANS standing for Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools. We had two rounds of EANS funding. One was CSRSA EANS, EANS 1, which started, I think, in 2001. And then a second round of EANS funding came about a year and a half ago for ARP EANS. Those are the two chunks of change that was given to non-public schools for COVID relief. What happened is after the EANS 2 funds were allocated to schools, there's still a big chunk of change for that funding source that was still available. And so what happened is the funds from EANS 2 got reverted to the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or GEER Fund, and the governor was therefore allowed to utilize those funds however he saw fit. And so in that vein, the governor decided to use the funds to support non-public schools that were affected by COVID. So $63 million unobligated from EANS 2 was reverted to GEER funds. So that's how we got where we are today. The governor's office elected to use those unobligated EANS 2 funds, now GEER funds, to develop the Non-Public Schools GEER Grant opportunity for Tennessee non-public schools. Now, as y'all know, we were in the second round of this funding source. So initially there was 133 schools that filled out an application back in December and were the initial recipients of these funds. Now that group has actually allocated all of their funds. There still remains a portion of the total grant amount available for allocations to you all. So I don't know the solid number right now. I think it's about $2.3 million is going to be able to be allocated for you all. We'll get your allocation emails to you by the end of the day. Where are we at? So just some high-level notes about this grant. Like I said, all the remaining unallocated grant dollars are going to be equally distributed to all eligible schools that completed the recent intent to participate. And your allocations will be determined based on your school enrollment data. So when you fill out your application, you told me what your enrollment was on May 11th, 2023. And that's the day that all schools enrollment was established. And that's what's going to determine your allocations. Similar to EANS 2.0, allocations will be provided to schools through contracted vendor services. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. Vendor contracts could have a start date as early as July 1st. All contracts will have an end date of 9/30/2024. And all allowable services and expenditures through each vendor must be made during the window outlined in that vendor's contract. So it may vary, it may start a little bit later, but all of them are going to end on 9/30/2024. And this will make more sense as we kind of go through the conversation today. Allocations must be spent in accordance with GEER or ESSER allowable guidance, not EANS. And again, you'll get more information on that moving forward. Also say, I know I moved quickly through this. If you have questions, if you want to just throw them in the chat, and I'll pause a few times to just get to some of those questions to make sure we're all on the same page. So allocations through contracted services. What this means is that the Department of Education is going to directly contract with and process payment for vendors providing allowable services for the benefit of schools. So what that means is we are engaging in a contract with a vendor a vendor that is providing services to you. It is a roundabout way that we're able to support schools without providing them direct funding. So high level, what that means, you guys are going to identify the vendors that you want to provide goods or services that are allowable under this grant. We are going to establish contracts with those vendors. The ones you identified, we're going to establish the contracts. The vendors are going to provide goods and services to the schools, and they're going to send invoices for payment to the TDOE. So that's going to, like, big picture what the relationship is going to look like when we're talking about allocations to contracted services. This varies from some other grants you all may have participated in the past. It is not a reimbursement grant. You're not getting the services for the school and then submitting the invoice and having us pay the school back. All the funding mechanism is going through the vendor, and they're just providing the services to the school. The funding window for this is as early as July 1st, 2023. That's the earliest that our contracts will start, and all contracts will end on September 30th, 2024. Dependent on when we get all of our paperwork in and submitted through our application, the start date may vary anywhere from July 1st up to August 1st, but just know that it's going to be in that window of time that we will have a start date for all of our contracts. All of our grant funds must be obligated by September 30th, 2024. That's the end of the grant term. And any contracted services that were provided prior to the contract date or after the liquidation period will not be eligible for payment. So if your vendor decides she or he wants to start doing something before the grant contract term, we will not be able to pay for it. It needs to be aligned with the grant contract. And again, that will make more sense as we go through the process moving forward. All right, so pause for some common GEER grant questions. First question, are schools required to submit poverty data to be eligible to receive these funds? Poverty data is not a required component for receiving these funds. I know it was for, I think, EANS 2, but that's not applicable for this funding source. Can my school be reimbursed for expenditures that occurred in prior years? No. Only services that occurred within the grant window and contracted through vendor services will be allowed for this grant. So we can't go back to the beginning of EANS 1 or the beginning of COVID. It's only for the contract terms that we've been discussing here. The third question, does the GEER grant provide direct funding to schools? Well, I've got two answers to you here. In most cases, if schools choose to use all external vendors, then no. It will not be providing direct funding to schools. All funding will be provided through contracted services with vendors providing allowable services to schools. Schools may also elect to identify themselves as a vendor. If schools decide to go this route, they will be direct recipients of federal funding. I'm going to pause there. We're going to come back to that in a second, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Just know that is an option that we can look at. All right, so allowable expenditures. When we're trying to identify if the services that we want for our schools are allowable, we need to ponder a few things. First of all activities supported with ESSER or GEER funds must relate to preventing, preparing for, and responding to COVID-19. Because this grant is now funded through GEER and no longer EANS, the new allowability guidance provides much more opportunities and flexibilities for schools to use their funds. So it's not as stringent. For those of you that used EANS in the past, it's not as stringent as those allowability guidelines. Some examples of what's in the allowability guidance. One of the components is providing principals and other school leaders the resources necessary to address the needs of their individual schools, or purchasing educational technology, including hardware, software, and connectivity for students. School facility repairs and improvements to enable operation of schools to reduce risk of virus transmission and exposure to environmental health hazards, or inspection, testing, maintenance, repair, replacement, and upgrade projects to improve the indoor air quality in school facilities. These are all examples of things that exist in the allowability guidance, which I've just put into the chat. The document that I just shared with you is a 97-page document. You'll want to look on pages 12, 13, and 14, and you will see 1 through 20. Those are the different pieces that are allowable for this grant. And so this image you see here is from those pages, and you'll notice that all of the things on these are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 20. That will become relevant in a second when we go forward and we talk about how we're going to justify the purchases that we want to make. So if you're trying to figure out if something that you want to get for your school is allowable, you are going to be required to provide justification for everything you submit in your application. You need to justify it doing with these 2 bullet points. Does the expenditure align with the intention of the grant, which is to prevent, prepare for, or respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, including its impact on the social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs of students? That's the first piece. And does the expenditure fit within one of the allowability categories on page 12 to 14 of the allowability document? So you want to make sure it's connected to COVID and it's connected to one of the 20 bullet points that is in that allowability document. If you can confidently answer and justify both those things when you're submitting your application, then the likelihood of your expenditure being considered allowable and therefore approved is very high. So I know that in the next few days, I'm going to get a lot of questions about, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? And 90% of the time, I'm going to push back and say, can you identify if it aligns with the intention of the grant? So is it aligned with the COVID-19 pandemic? And does it fit within one of the allowability categories? If those 2 things are true, then it is probably going to be good to go. Some examples of how you can justify that. A&H air conditioning will be replacing 24 HVAC units throughout the building. The new units have HEPA filters that will improve the indoor air quality, allowability number 18, and therefore decrease the spread of COVID-19 in our building. That blurb right there addresses those 2 questions. How is it connected to COVID, and which of the allowability guidance does it lend to that makes it happen? The second one on here, Dragstar Communications will be installing security cameras throughout the building. These cameras will allow us to reduce risk of virus transmission, allowability number 17, by providing us with a means to monitor contact tracing throughout the building. Again, it addresses the 2 things that need to be addressing. Where's an allowability document and how's it connected to COVID? So these would both be considered allowable items based off of the description that's being given here. It is our intention to approve as much as we possibly can. We want to make sure that schools get these funds and they're there to support our kiddos. But we need to make sure that we can only approve things if they've been rightly justified using the guidance that's been provided here. All right, so now when we get into thinking of the vendors that we're going to use for our goods or services, you may use any vendor you like for your allowable services. Any vendor that's in your community, someone you work with already, any vendor you can use for your allowable services. Any vendor used must submit a W-9 and complete a vendor budget form in order for a contract to be generated. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. I will also be providing you all with a known vendor list. And this is just a list of vendors that schools have used in the past. You don't have to use these vendors. You don't even have to look at the list. It's just there's a resource. It should give you an idea of what have schools used, how's it been beneficial in the past. Maybe I can use that same vendor or a vendor like it. But again, you are not required to use anyone on the known vendor list. It is just a resource to look at. As I mentioned earlier, schools can also choose to identify themselves as a vendor. This would allow schools to submit invoices for the reimbursement of any allowable purchases they make in their school building. Now, if a school chooses to utilize this option, it would be considered direct funding, and the school would be subject to federal laws and regulations for the duration of the grant period. If this is an avenue that you feel like you want to take, please reach out to me and I'll get you additional guidance that will give you a little bit more information about how that could impact your school, or if that's an option that may make sense to you. All right, so now we're going to look at the nitty-gritty of this process, the contracted services step by step. What's going to happen is today, I'm going to be sending all of you an email with your grant allocation. It's going to tell you how much money you have for this grant to assign to vendor contracts. What you're going to do when you receive that email is you are going to figure out which vendors you would like to use to provide those goods or services that are allowable for the grant. So let's say that you receive an allocation of $100,000 and you want to do an HVAC project in your building that's going to cost you $40,000. And you want to buy computers that are going to cost you $30,000. You're going to get as many contracts as you can compiled to total the amount of your allocation. You can't go over it, but you want to get as close as you can to your allocation so you're not underutilizing those funds. So I give you an allocation. You identify which vendors you want to use to provide those goods and services, and then you will reach out to the vendor to determine pricing and services for the contract. You're doing all the legwork, and you and the vendor are gonna fill out a vendor budget form that identifies those terms and identifies the terms of the contract that the Tennessee Department of Education is going to put together with the vendor. Jacqueline will get to that in just a second. Once you've got a completed vendor budget form and a W-9 for all of your vendors, then you're going to submit them, upload them into ePlan, which is the platform where we're going to gather all this information. And you're going to submit it all through there. That's where your final application is going to be submitted. Once all that information is sent to the TDOE, we are going to reach out to the vendors to issue a contract between us and the vendor. Once that's all executed and good to go, the vendors are going to continue providing goods and services to you, and they're going to submit invoices to us. So we're going to pay the invoices for the services that they're going to be providing. What it will look like is they'll provide us an invoice. We will come to you and say, was this service actually done? You'll say yes, and then we'll pay them for it. That's the kind of the step-by-step of what that will look like. The reason I like to bring this up is because I want to make sure that we understand, like, Amazon is not going to be a vendor that we'd be able to set up, because we're not going to be able to set up a contract with Amazon. You're not going to be able to sit down with the person at Amazon and have them fill out a vendor budget form. It needs to be, usually more local folks are better about this than others, but it needs to be someone you can sit down with who's going to be able to provide you with the W-9 and all of their tax information. You want to make sure that it is a vendor that is willing to engage in this relationship with the state of Tennessee. A little more context there. This form right here, is the vendor budget form. I know it's really tiny, but I wanted you to see what, yes, I'm recording and I'll send it out to everyone. I wanted you to see some of the things that folks have asked questions about in the past. So all the information on the left is required from vendors. Their legal entity name, their organization type, the state where they're organized, all that's going to be required from vendors. What's also, the two things I have boxed are the vendor Edison supplier ID. This we don't need. We are going to get it with them when we reach out to the vendors. The second thing is a UEI, which is a unique entity identifier. Any entity that receives funding from the federal government is required to register with the sam.gov and get a UEI. Your vendor may not have one, or they may not know about one. All they need to do is go to sam.gov and they will be able to register for one. It might take them a week or two to get it, but at least they'll start the process. This is listed on the form, but I did want to name that because you're going to get some pushback from vendors about what that's supposed to look like. The second thing over here is the grant budget. The grant budget needs to be filled out for every vendor on the vendor budget form. Now, there is guidance on the vendor budget form for how to fill this out. This is the responsibility of the vendor, not you. However, the vendors are going to push back a little bit. So you're going to want to make sure that they don't do what they need to do. What's sacred to me is that this bottom box in the lower right, the grand total, matches the amount that you submitted for this vendor. So if you said that this is going to be a $50,000 contract, that can't say $46,000 on there. They need to say the same thing, and they need to all line up for that. Again, additional guidance for this, there's a link for it on the form, but I just wanted to kind of put these in front of folks because these are questions that I get a lot. This is things I get a lot of questions about. All right, so that's all the high level, like what we need to do and what we need to think about. What I'm going to go over now is the actual application and what you will do to fill out the application, where you click, all of that. Like I said, this is going to be recorded, so I will be able to send the recording out to all y'all, and you'll be able to follow along when you're doing your application yourself. So like I mentioned, in order to receive the grant funds, you must complete an application in ePlan. ePlan is a grant management platform that is used by the Tennessee Department of Education. Within ePlan, we're going to gather updated school information from you. We're going to ask schools how they intend to use their allocation, and you're going to list all of the contracted services that you've set up. So you're going to list all of them in this form, and you're going to upload all the documents for those as well. The application for this is already open in ePlan, and all of the schools have been assigned to this application. So if you already have ePlan access, you may be able to see it already. Applications should be submitted by 11:59 p.m. on June 9th, Friday, June 9th, for contracts to have a July 1st, 2023 start date. Any application materials submitted after that time will have a later contract start date. We do have a drop dead date, which I think is two weeks after that, but our goal is to get our resources in as quickly as possible so we can make sure we get these contracts set up and we get schools the services they need. So the first thing you need to do to make sure you're on track there is you need to make sure your users have the proper ePlan roles. I just did this with 130 other schools, and a lot of folks just skipped this step. Please don't skip this step. The first thing you need to do is an easy thing to do is you need to identify one school user with the role LEA authorized representative and one with the role non-public GEER grant director, and you got to get them signed up in ePlan. I've even pasted the user form access form if you want to go ahead and do that at the end of this call or whenever makes sense. But if you set those up quickly, you will not have any problems maneuvering the grant later. So this is definitely the first thing that you're going to want to do. It can be the same person. If you want one person to have both those roles, that is completely okay. Whatever makes the most sense to you. But in order to maneuver the application, you need to have both these people. If you don't have both of them, you will get stuck. The next thing you'll want to do is begin gathering vendor information. So again, we've already talked about what this looks like, but reaching out to vendors who have the services that your school is interested in, discussing those services, getting the information, and starting to move forward. Once you've got all of that, we're going to get into ePlan. I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker than I usually would because I've actually got a manual that actually does the same thing, and you can flip through the manual while you're doing the application. But what we're looking at here is the ePlan platform. This is what the corner of the screen looks like. And the first thing you're going to do when you log into ePlan is you're going to click on Data and Information in the left toolbar. From there, it's going to bring up this screen. You're going to want to make sure that 2023 is selected, and you're going to click on Non-Public GEER Grant. This is going to bring you to the landing page for this grant and all the application information you're putting in. What you're going to do to get started is you're going to click on Draft Started to begin your application. And say that again, click on Draft Started to begin your application. A lot of schools will struggle. They forget to click the Draft Started button, and everything will be grayed out, and they won't know why they can't input information. It's because you haven't started your draft yet. So that's definitely the first step that you need to do in order to get started on the application. Once you've done that, you'll be able to go through all of the different fields listed in the sections. So you will start on Introduction. The introduction is just going to give you a general overview of the grant and lists out the grant eligibility requirements. Once you've reviewed that, you can go ahead and click on Save and Go To and click on Next Page. Now I'm going to tell you guys right now that since the second opportunity wasn't initially the plan, it does state an application due date that is prior to now. Your application due date is the goal of June 9th with the opportunity to submit things later as needed as long as we're communicating about them. The next page is the cover page. This is where we're just going to collect the most updated information about your school. Who do we need to contact? What are their numbers? What is your enrollment number? It should match the one that we've already shared. Once that's been completely filled out, you're going to do the same things. Go Save and Go To the next page. And this is going to bring you to the program details page. On this page, you just need to answer 3 prompts. They're short narrative responses. The questions are pertaining to how you've been impacted by COVID, what plans you've made to support your COVID plan, and what data you have to collect it. So just do the best you can to answer all parts of the prompt that are provided. And then once you've done that for all 3 of the questions, you'll again click on Save and Go To. And that brings you to the meat of the application. This is the Contracted Services Information page. This is where you're going to do most of your work. This is what we're going to be evaluating and checking against your forms. This is how we're going to determine what contracts are set up. This page is set up with 4 different sections. The top section is an overview. It gives you some general information about the vendors and what that should look like. Below that, it says general contract notes and reminders. Below that, instructions for completing the contracted services table. And lastly, the contracted services table. The contracted services table is where you're going to be inputting your information. You'll see right here on the picture we have here, there's 1 line available. This is for 1 vendor. If I had multiple vendors, I would click on the Add Row button in the lower left, and I'll be able to add more rows for additional vendors. For each vendor, I'm going to select a service type, and there's 5 options for those. You just pick whichever one makes the most sense for what you're doing. You're going to put in your service details. Your service details are where you are identifying, you're answering the question that we've asked before. For your service details, does the expenditure align with the intention of the grant, and does it fit within one of the allowability categories on page 12 to 14? This is where you are providing your justification for your purchase. This is what we're going to be reviewing to make sure if it's allowable or not. If we don't get that evidence in this response, we will kick it back and say this may not be allowable. Can you please provide a greater explanation? So just know this is where that needs to be filled out. You're also going to be put the vendor legal entity name. This should be the same name that they list on their W-9, which isn't always necessarily the name they have on their storefront. So just make sure you look at their W-9 when you're putting this in. Edison ID you will only populate if it is a known vendor or if they provide it, but most vendors will not have an Edison ID, so you can leave that blank. And then the last section is cost. This is the amount of the contract that is going to be established. We will not be able to change contract amounts after the contracts have been generated. So if the cost of an item changes, you're still stuck to the previous cost. So make sure that when you're negotiating and working with your vendors, you identify what makes the most sense. If there's a great chance that the cost of the item will increase, maybe ask them to run the contract for a little bit more so your school doesn't have to pay out of pocket for the difference. Another thing I'll point out for this cost section is it is only whole numbers. You will not be able to do cents in this. So you're only going to be doing whole dollars. So, and that's how the grant contract is going to be generated as well. So just be mindful of that when you're putting your numbers in, that it's not going to have 53,027 cents. 27 cents is not going to go into this field. The next page you'll go to is the assurances page. This is where you just verify that all of the information you submitted is true and it's all in alignment with the grant allowability and terms. And again, you'll read those to get guidance there. You'll click on the checkbox, click on save and go to, and click on next. And this brings us to our related documents page. This is where we will be uploading all of the vendor budget information forms and all of the W-9s for all of our vendors. You must have a vendor budget information form and a W-9 for every vendor that you intend to use for this grant. In order to upload your forms, you're going to click on Upload New. You'll locate the form on your computer, and then you'll go ahead and save it, and it will put it into the field there. I prefer that they're uploaded individually as PDFs. If that's something you struggle with, we'll take Microsoft Doc files as well, but PDF is the ideal place to upload this for. Once you've got all of your documents uploaded, you've got your contracted services table completed, and your application is complete, you'll go to that sections page again, click on Draft Completed, and click on Confirm. And then this is where that second user role really becomes important. In order for it to be fully submitted, the LEA authorized representative needs to approve it as well. So they will log in, they'll click on LEA authorized representative approved, and they'll click on Confirm, and then your application will be submitted to the TDOE. The next step there is I will go ahead and I will review your application, make sure that all the expenditures that you have are allowable based off of the guidance you provided. Make sure that you did not allocate more than you are your school has provided, so you didn't put more contracts than your school has provided. And I'll just review all the rest of your application to make sure everything is on the up and up. If it is, I'll send you an email saying, hey, on the initial review, your application looks good, and we will start working to generate those contracts with those vendors. That's the ePlan process. Again, this is being recorded, so we'll be able to send it to you there. And I've got a step-by-step document that you'll be able to utilize when you're doing this yourself as well. So your immediate action items, the things that you want to do now. After this call, probably within the next 30 to 45 minutes after this call, I'm going to be sending schools their allocations. These are going to be our preliminary allocations. There's a chance they could change, but they're not going to go down. They might go up. If for some reason you see your allocation or you go through this webinar and you say, Adam, I'm not really feeling this anymore, please just let us know by 4 o'clock tomorrow if that's your intention, if you want to opt out. And in that case, we'll be able to reallocate your funds to other schools. So review your allocation email, make sure it's got all the information you want, make sure you still want us to come in. Next step is to set up your ePlan users. Again, I put the link in here for how you're going to add your user access form for folks. That's going to be the next step you're going to want to do. Then you'll start talking with your vendors. From experience working with other schools, vendors are not always quick getting quotes or completing the vendor budget forms. Sometimes you have to track them down. So getting started right away is going to help you make this happen. I have a lot of schools that are still like, they waited till the last minute and it's catching them. So you want to make sure you're not in that position. And then lastly, complete your ePlan application. You'll need all your vendor budget forms and W-9s for a full submission, but you can still complete most of the rest of the application without those. You can still fill out the program details. You can still fill out the cover sheet. Just get it all started so you've got all the information to submit when you're ready to go. Big picture timeline. The application is already open to you. June 9th is the first due date for your ePlan application. June 16th is the second due date. If we're potentially moving past June 16th, we just need to communicate, make sure we've got a plan set up so that we can get all the things we need to do in anticipation and we can get your contracts generated. End of June, early July is when we're going to build those contracts with vendors. And in July, we're going to assign POs so your vendors can get paid. That is the meat of my presentation there. Let's look at some of the questions we have here. And if you guys have more, you can go ahead and throw them in the chat. You can come off of mute. So Jacqueline, if we use an outside vendor, it's not considered federal, so we don't have to follow 5 more. If you are not identifying yourself as a vendor for this grant, then you are not a direct recipient of federal funds. Does that answer your question? Cool. And then, yes, Michelle, I'm going to be uploading this. It takes about 48 hours for my comms team to put it into a shareable link, but I'll get it to you guys all when that's done. Are there any other questions that folks have? This is the time to ask them. If you want to come off of mute, you can ask them, or if you want to put them into the chat. I'm going to be sending you a known vendor list that has vendors that you can use. They're definitely not the only vendors they're not the only vendors you can use. You can use any vendor you want, but I will be providing you with a known vendor list of vendors that folks have used in the past. All right, if we don't have any more questions, again, my name's Adam Holdren. You will be hearing from me a lot in the next few weeks. The best way to get a hold of me is you can send an email to the eanes.grant@tn.gov email address. I monitor that daily. It's easier for me to actually respond to these supports through there than it is from my personal email, my personal work email, but either of them do work. But if you guys don't have any more questions, thank you guys for joining today. I'll be sending you an email in a little bit that gives you some general guidance about what we talked about, and your allocation email should be coming soon. All right. Thanks, y'all.